Okay, so let's briefly review the cardiac syncytium. Okay, now again, this is going to be a very, very basic version of what your book talks about. But again, I just kind of want to give you some images and a little talk to think about this. Now, remember that when we talked about the heart in class, we said that the cardiac muscle cells are all fused together. Okay, the cardiac muscle cells have these areas called intercalated discs. All right, these discs anchor every cardiac muscle cell together, or to possibly these autorhythmic or these pacemaker type cells in the heart. But when you actually take a look at heart muscle underneath the microscope, that you don't just see you don't just see a bunch of individual cells with nerves going to them like skeletal muscle. Okay, what you see is you see a bunch of cardiac muscle cells all joined together. So what we're saying here is that when one cardiac muscle cell depolarizes, that wave of depolarization is going to be propagated or transferred from cell to cell to cell to cell until every single muscle cell in the heart has been stimulated to contract. All right, and that's the fused nature of the heart, and that's what we call the cardiac syncytium. So what we say is that the heart, when cardiac muscle contracts, the cardiac muscle of the heart acts like it's one sheet of muscle, like it's one whole unit. Whereas with skeletal muscle, remember that there are individual motor neurons going to skeletal muscle, and when we need to, like for example, if I need to, I don't know, just pick up this eraser and this chalk, okay, I don't need to stimulate every muscle cell in my bicep to contract in order to lift these. This isn't that heavy of an object. That's just a waste. So I would only need to stimulate, only a few skeletal muscle cells to contract, while the others still remain at rest. Okay, with the heart, when we depolarize one cell in the heart, all the others will eventually become depolarized. Okay, so that's how cardiac muscle behaves as one individual unit. All right. Now, with the cardiac, now basically these autorhythmic cells, as your book describes, basically what they are, they're just parts of the cardiac conduction system. All right, and again, you'll see a video in a little bit about it. Kind of gives a basic talk about the major parts of the cardiac conduction system. But basically, all these autorhythmic cells these are cells that kind of have their own inherent rate of depolarization. These are cells that are always depolarizing, repolarizing, depolarizing, repolarizing. So if you were to look at their action potentials, it would look like you'd see a little bit of a big upward spike and then back down, and then like this, and then this is what it would look like all your entire life. Okay, is just a little bit of depolarization, rapid depolarization, repolarization, and then back again. These cells have this very oscillating type of behavior. Okay, and again, they don't stop until you stop. All right. Now, basically, what happens are as these cells depolarize, when you kind of see this upward spike, you see a slow influx of sodium. Okay, so as sodium, as you know that these cells have negative membrane potentials. That as sodium comes in, that's going to cause a positive change across the membrane and make the inside of the cell more positive. All right, and then what happens next is then as more sodium comes in, then you'll see this little bigger upward spike, and then that's when you see a bigger influx of calcium enter the cell. All right, and then that's when you see the actual depolar, and that's basically what makes it depolarize at a rapid rate. All right, excuse me, and then potassium out, and then this whole thing starts over again. Okay, so basically what happens here is as this cell is depolarizing, okay, and then potassium out. Okay, so as this autorhythmic cell is depolarizing, as sodium and calcium are coming in, potassium is going out, what's happening is this action potential is being transferred to the adjacent cardiac muscle cells. All right, now this is kind of neat. So now as you can see, these little blue lines are very arbitrary representations of structures that we call gap junctions. Okay, gap junctions. Okay, so basically what these are little protein ion channels that you find in between cells, where there's in between cellular spaces. Okay, that's why they're called gap junctions. Okay, and they're within, again, those intercalated discs that I mentioned earlier that kind of anchor all these cells, these muscle cells together. Okay, so basically, some of this sodium and calcium that diffused into this pacemaker cell, some of it will move through the gap junction into the adjacent cardiac muscle cell. Okay, and again, the sodium potassium pumps will be moving the rest of the sodium and calcium back out, potassium back in. But now let's shift our attention over to here. So now, as sodium and calcium move through the gap junction into the adjacent cardiac muscle cell, now the resting membrane potential is going to change. It's going to become more positive. It's going to become less, it's going to start to depolarize the cell just because of the presence of these positively charged ions. Because remember, the resting membrane potential of these is negative 90 millivolts. Okay, and then what will happen next is that's going to make sodium gates, these electrically sensitive gates. That's going to make sodium gates open, and then more sodium is going to come in. Okay, and then as a result, that's going to cause more calcium to come in, potassium go out, and then the same thing that happened with this pacemaker cell is now going to happen to this adjacent muscle cell. Some of the sodium and calcium that come in are now going to move to the next muscle cell, and then this is all. Then the action potential is going to make, after this muscle contracts, that's going to make this muscle contract, and then the next muscle, adjacent muscle, and then so on until this wave of depolarization has moved throughout the entire cardiac syncytium, until it has moved throughout the entire, every single muscle cell. Okay. And again, that's really basically the cardiac syncytium. Okay, again, the whole point of this discussion is just to get the picture in your head that all the muscle cells are joined together, and when we depolarize, one area of the heart, that wave of depolarization is going to be transferred from cell to cell to cell to cell because of this joining nature. Okay, and again, when we say that wave of depolarization is going to be transferred, all we're saying is our ions are just going to be moving from cell to cell to cell, stimulating it to contract. Okay. Now in the next video, we're going to talk a little more about the electrical events that occur during a cardiac muscle action potential.